Hey, can you hear the storm outside? Maybe it is real, or maybe it is just in your mind tonight. Either way, I'm Nick, the real Nick from Chilling Lullabies, and you are safe inside here with me. Let the chaos stay out there while we create something calm and peaceful in here together. These scary stories and gentle sounds will be your shelter tonight, your refuge from everything that feels too loud or too much. Just a handful of ads in the first 10 minutes, then hours of uninterrupted storytelling ahead. If this shelter becomes your safe place when the storms come, please subscribe and tap that like button so others can find safety here too. Tell me in the comments where your storm is raging from tonight. You are protected here. Now let us breathe together and begin. Eli Valen's hands rested easy on the wheel, the leather worn smooth where his palms had shaped it over the years. Rain hammered the windshield in rhythmic bursts, the wipers struggling to clear the water fast enough. He'd driven this stretch of Highway 101 100 times, knew every curve and switchback, the way the road hugged the cliffs above the Pacific. The ocean was invisible beyond the guardrail, lost in the storm, but he could feel it out there. Vast and indifferent and cold. The turnoff to his property was 2 miles ahead. He'd have a fire going within the hour, scotch poured, the storm reduced to background noise behind triple-pane glass. The house had cost him more than his first 3 films combined, but it was worth it. Isolation was a luxury most people couldn't afford. He could. The figure appeared suddenly in his headlights, standing beside a car with its hood propped open. A young woman soaked through, waving one arm in a gesture that was more plea than signal. Eli's foot moved to the brake before his mind had fully registered the decision. He pulled onto the narrow shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires. She ran to his window. Dark hair plastered to her skull, pale skin, eyes too wide. Early 20s, perhaps. He rolled the window down 2 inches. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw. The battery was dead, she explained, gesturing at the Honda behind her. Her phone had gotten soaked through her bag. She was headed to Manzanita, staying with a friend. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, the question unspoken but obvious. Eli glanced at the car. An old Honda, rust creeping up from the wheel wells, Oregon plates. The kind of vehicle that belonged to someone scraping by, not someone who could afford roadside assistance. He told her to get in. He'd take her as far as the junction, let her call someone from there. She hesitated, water dripping from her chin, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she nodded and hurried to the passenger side. She climbed in, bringing with her the smell of rain and something else. Salt, seaweed, the ocean itself. She gave her name as Margot, pulling the seatbelt across her chest. He offered his own. He put the car in gear and eased back onto the highway. The rain intensified, turning the road ahead into a blur of gray. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Eli kept his attention on the center line, the way it disappeared and reappeared in the downpour. Margot sat very still beside him, her hands folded in her lap, water pooling beneath her shoes on the floor mat. Then she turned her head and stared out the passenger window at the darkness beyond. "It's so cold," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. The cold dark at the bottom. Eli glanced at her. "What?" But she didn't answer. Her breath had fogged the glass. She lifted one finger and drew a slow line through the condensation, vertical, wavering slightly. Then another, and another. 4 lines close together like the bars of a cage, or fingers reaching. Eli returned his attention to the road. Drama students, he thought. They were everywhere up here, spilling out of Portland's theater programs, driving up and down the coast looking for inspiration, or cheap rent, or both. She was probably rehearsing something, running lines in her head. He'd seen it before. The wipers beat their steady rhythm. Margot's breathing had gone shallow, quick, and uneven, as though she'd been running. "Do you know what it's like?" she whispered. "Under the water. How long it takes." Eli's hands tightened on the wheel. "Look, if you're not feeling well." "Sound stops first," Margot continued, her voice taking on a strange rhythmic quality. "Then the light. Then everything else. But the cold stays. The cold stays forever." Eli said nothing. His jaw ached from clenching. He told himself it was the storm making him uneasy, the way the wind kept shoving the car toward the shoulder, the visibility down to almost nothing. Not her. Not the way she sat so motionless, staring out at the black ocean he couldn't see but could feel pressing in. The headlights caught the orange reflectors of a warning sign. Mudslide area. Then 50 yards ahead, the road simply ended. A mass of earth and rock and uprooted trees had slid down from the hillside above, completely blocking both lanes. Eli hit the brakes. The Range Rover skidded slightly on the wet pavement before stopping 20 feet from the debris. He sat there, engine idling, staring at the wall of mud. The junction was on the other side. Manzanita was on the other side. Everything was on the other side. Margot turned to look at him for the first time since they'd started driving. Her eyes were very dark, the pupils swallowed by the iris, and her face held no expression at all. Eli put the car in reverse. There was a pullout a mile back, and from there a private road that led up to his property. He'd have to take her there, let her use the landline, wait out the storm until the county crews cleared the highway. A few hours, no more. He'd done worse favors for strangers. The house appeared through the trees as he turned onto the gravel drive. All glass and timber, cantilevered over the cliff edge, the windows blazing with the light he'd left on that morning. He pulled into the carport and killed the engine. The rain drummed on the metal roof above them, deafening in the enclosed space. Margot opened her door and stepped out before he could say anything about waiting for the rain to ease. She walked toward the house, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were wading through deep water. Eli grabbed his keys and followed, rain soaking through his jacket in seconds. He unlocked the front door and reached inside to flip the light switch. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. The power was out. Of course it was. Behind him, Margot stood on the porch, water streaming from her hair and clothes, her face turned up toward the sky. Lightning split the clouds, illuminating her for one brief moment. Skin like paper, eyes reflecting nothing. And then the darkness returned, thicker than before. Eli found the flashlight in the hall closet and led her inside. The beam cut through the gloom, catching the edge of furniture, the gleam of rain-streaked windows. The house felt wrong without electricity, all its modern confidence stripped away, reduced to just another structure at the mercy of the storm. He told her the phone was in the kitchen, that the landline should still work even with the power out. He swept the flashlight beam ahead of them down the hallway. But when they reached the kitchen, Margot wasn't behind him anymore. Eli turned, playing the flashlight beam back across the open living room, down the hallway towards the bedrooms, empty. He called her name. His voice echoed against the high ceilings and died. The house had never seemed large before. Now it stretched around him in all directions, full of corners the flashlight couldn't reach, and spaces that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. He moved back toward the living room, his footsteps loud on the hardwood. A sound stopped him. Soft, rhythmic, dripping water. He followed it to the mouth of the hallway. There on the polished floor, a small pool of water glistened in the flashlight beam. And leading away from it, a trail of wet footprints, the edges already beginning to dry. They headed deeper into the house toward the guest bedrooms at the far end. Eli's mouth had gone dry. He made himself move forward, following the trail. The footprints were small, narrow, bare feet. But Margot had been wearing shoes. He'd seen them in the car, canvas sneakers, soaked through. The trail stopped outside the second guest room. The door stood half open. Eli pushed it wider and stepped inside, sweeping the flashlight across the space. The bed was made undisturbed. The window was latched. The closet door hung open, revealing nothing but empty hangers. Lightning flashed outside, turning the room stark white for half a second. In that brief illumination, Eli saw her, standing in the far corner beside the dresser, her back to him, her hair hanging down in dark ropes that dripped steadily onto the floor. Then the darkness returned, and when he swung the flashlight toward the corner, she was gone. Eli backed out of the room. His heart slammed against his ribs. This was absurd. She was playing with him, hiding in the house, trying to frighten him. Some elaborate stunt, an audition piece maybe. He was Eli Valen. People knew who he was, what he did. She had probably recognized him, planned this whole thing. The broken-down car, the storm, all of it staged. Very impressive, he called out, his voice too loud. Really top marks for commitment. But you can drop the act now. I'm not casting anything at the moment. The house answered with silence and the steady drum of rain on the roof. Eli made his way back to the kitchen, his hand tight around the flashlight. His films had made millions. He'd stood on stages in front of thousands. He knew fear, knew how to craft it, manipulate it, make audiences feel it in their bones. But he'd never felt it himself, not like this. This cold, creeping certainty that something was terribly wrong. He picked up the kitchen phone and held it to his ear. Dead. The storm must have taken out the lines. Another sound reached him from somewhere deeper in the house. Not dripping this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Moving across the floor above his head. The second floor, his bedroom, his study. The spaces he'd built to be his alone. Eli climbed the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. The flashlight beam jumped ahead of him, sliding across walls, catching the edges of door frames. The footsteps had stopped. At the top of the stairs, he paused, listening. A door closed somewhere to his left. Soft, careful. The sound of someone who didn't want to be heard. He moved down the hallway toward his study. The door was shut, though he couldn't remember closing it that morning. He put his hand on the knob. It was wet. He opened the door. The study was as he'd left it. Desk against the window, bookshelves lining two walls, the leather chair turned slightly toward the door. But the air smelled wrong. Salt and rot and something deeper, older. The smell of the ocean floor where light never reached. Lightning flashed, and in that instant, he saw her reflection in the window glass, standing directly behind him. Her face was inches from the back of his head, mouth open, eyes fixed on his reflection with an intensity that made his stomach lurch. He spun around, empty air. The flashlight beam caught nothing but dust motes drifting in the darkness. "This isn't funny anymore," Eli said, and heard the tremor in his voice despite himself. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but hush now, hush now, hush." The words came from everywhere and nowhere, whispered in that same rasping voice she'd used in the car, a lullaby cadence, soft and terrible. "The water wants you. The cold dark wants you." Eli's throat closed. He knew those words. He knew that rhythm. But he couldn't remember from where, couldn't make his mind reach back far enough to grasp the memory that was clawing at the edges of his consciousness. Hush now, hush, down to the deep, down to sleep. His legs moved without conscious decision, backing him toward the door. The flashlight slipped in his sweating palm. This wasn't an audition. This couldn't be an audition. No one could fake the wrongness that pressed against him from all sides, the sense that the house itself had turned malevolent, that every shadow held something watching. He stumbled out of the study and down the stairs, taking them two at a time, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind him, and that rasping whisper followed him through the house like smoke, formless and inescapable. Eli reached the living room and stopped, chest heaving. Think. He had to think. She was just a woman, just a person. This was his house, his space. She was the intruder, not him. The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, Eli heard his own ragged breathing, and the rain and nothing else. He swept the flashlight in a slow arc across the room. The beam caught the window, the couch, the cold fireplace, She stood in the far corner, between the bookshelf and the wall, perfectly still. Her arms hung at her sides, palms forward, fingers slightly curled. Her head was tilted at an angle that made his vision swim too far, as though her neck had been broken. Water ran down her face in steady streams, pooling at her feet. Lightning flashed. In the white light, he saw her clearly. The blue tinge to her lips, the way her eyes didn't blink, the dark hollows of her cheeks. She looked drowned. She looked like something that had been in the water for a very long time. Thunder followed, shaking the windows. When Eli's vision cleared, she had moved. Closer. 5 feet closer. But he hadn't seen her move, hadn't heard her. "Stay back," he said, and his voice came out thin and high. "Just stay the hell back." She took another step, then another. The water trail followed her, dark and glistening. Her mouth opened and the words came out in that rasping whisper that scraped against his eardrums. You remember the cold." "I don't know what you're talking about," Eli said, but his hands were shaking so badly. The flashlight beam jerked across the walls. "You're just some obsessed fan, some drama student, and this has gone far enough." You remember her voice, the way she called your name. Lightning again, and in its glow he saw Margot's face shift, the features rearranging into something familiar and terrible. Not Margot. Someone else. Someone he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten the weight of it. "The way she begged," Margot whispered. "The way the water filled her mouth and she couldn't scream anymore. The way she sank. You remember?" Eli's chest constricted. The flashlight fell from his hand and rolled across the floor, the beam spinning, casting wild shadows. He couldn't breathe, couldn't pull air past the band of iron crushing his ribs. His left arm had gone numb, heavy and useless. The pain bloomed behind his sternum, white-hot and spreading. Margot stood before him, water streaming from her hair, and began to sing again in that broken, gurgling voice. "Hush now, hush, down to the deep, down to sleep. The cold dark is waiting. The cold dark knows." Eli's knees buckled. He went down hard, his shoulder slamming against the floor. The pain in his chest had become everything, blotting out thought, crushing the air from his lungs. He tried to speak, to call for help, but nothing came out except a wet, desperate sound. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Margot's face above his, watching with those flat, drowned eyes. The last thing he heard was her voice, singing him down. "Hush now, hush now, hush." The singing stopped. Margot stood over Eli's body and her chest heaving, her whole frame shaking. Then the character fell away completely. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hand going to his neck, searching for a pulse. Her fingers pressed against cold skin. Nothing. No flutter, no beat. Nothing. For a full minute she couldn't move, couldn't think. Her hand remained pressed to his throat, waiting for something that would never come. The flashlight lay on the floor where he'd dropped it, its beam cutting across his face at an angle that made the shadows pool in his open eyes. The rain continued its steady percussion on the roof. The house creaked and settled around her, and Eli Valen stayed dead. The reality crashed over her in waves. She'd killed him. Not with a weapon, not with violence, but with performance. With research and commitment, and 3 lines of melody she'd invented in her apartment 2 weeks ago. She'd only meant to scare him, to prove she could do it, that she had the presence, the control, the ability to inhabit fear so completely that even a master would believe it. She'd researched for weeks, practiced the voice until her throat was raw, choreographed every movement. The water was from bottles in her bag. The bare feet were her own shoes kicked off in the dark. The singing was just something she'd made up, improvised from scraps of lullabies and her own imagination. It was supposed to be impressive, unsettling, memorable. It wasn't supposed to kill him. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, God. Oh, God, no." Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them against her thighs to make them stop. Then, finally, her survival instincts kicked in. She scrambled to her feet and ran for the kitchen, her wet socks sliding on the hardwood. Phone. She needed a phone. The landline was dead, but there had to be a cell phone somewhere, a charger, something. She yanked open drawers, scattering their contents across the counter. Pens, batteries, manuals for appliances. Nothing useful. She found a candle and matches in the 3rd drawer, lit it, and used the wavering light to search the rest of the kitchen. Nothing. She moved to the living room, stepping carefully around Eli's body, trying not to look at his face, the way his eyes stared at nothing. The flashlight had rolled under the couch. She retrieved it, and the beam caught something she hadn't noticed before. A door set into the wall beside the fireplace, partially hidden by a tall bookshelf. She pulled the bookshelf aside, the wood scraping against the floor, and tried the door. Locked. No, not locked. Latched. She worked the mechanism with shaking fingers and pulled it open. A small office, windowless, barely larger than a closet. A desk, a filing cabinet, a lamp. She swept the flashlight across the surfaces, looking for anything. A phone, a laptop, anything she could use to call for help. Her hand brushed against a wooden box on the corner of the desk, heavy and solid. It tipped, overbalanced, and crashed to the floor. The lid split on impact, and the contents spilled across the worn rug. Margot froze. Papers, photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings held together with rusted paper clips. A locket on a tarnished chain. And beneath it all, a small leather journal, its pages water-stained and warped. She picked up the closest clipping with nerveless fingers. The headline was nearly illegible. The ink faded to brown. Woman missing off coastal highway. Below it, a photograph. Dark hair, pale skin, white eyes. Young. 23, according to the text. Last seen near Neoconaim Mountain. Vehicle found abandoned. Search ongoing. The date was September 1967. Margot's hands trembled as she picked up another clipping. Same woman. Different headline. Search called off after 2 weeks. Presumed drowned. The ocean had given up nothing. The currents along the stretch of coast were treacherous. Bodies were rarely recovered. There were more. A dozen clippings, maybe more, all yellowed with age. All the same woman. Lena Corbin, 23 years old. Drama student from Portland, last seen accepting a ride from a passing motorist during a storm. The locket had fallen open. Inside was a photograph, protected behind scratched glass. The same woman. But this photo was informal, candid, sitting on a beach somewhere, smiling at the camera, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. On the back, in faded pencil, Mylana, October 1966. Margot's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes and picked up the journal, flipping it open to a random page. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, the words running together in places where water had made the ink bleed. November 3rd, 1967. Can't sleep. Keep seeing her face in the window. The way she looked at me when she understood what was happening. The way she screamed. But it's quiet now. I made it quiet. The water made it quiet. Margot turned the page, her stomach churning. December 18, 1967. Sold the car, bought a new one. Told my family I needed a change. No one asks questions. The papers say the currents took her. They don't know about the rocks, about how you can push someone in a place where the undertow does the rest. They don't know how easy it is to make someone disappear. The entries continued, sporadic, spanning years. Fragments of guilt and justification tangled together. He'd been 27. She'd refused him. She'd threatened to tell his mother, his colleagues. She'd laughed at him. So he'd offered her a ride during a storm, and he'd driven her here, to this house his family had just built. And he'd... Margot's hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped the journal. She forced herself to keep reading. March 1968. The singing won't stop. I hear it when I'm trying to sleep. Her lullaby. The one she hummed in the car. Hush now, hush. But it's just in my head. Just my mind playing tricks. She's gone. She's been gone for months. The entries grew shorter after that, more scattered. By the 1970s, they'd stopped altogether. The last entry was dated June 1972. Haven't thought about her in weeks. Finally free. Margot sat back on her heels, the journal clutched against her chest. The research she'd done had been for a role. She'd wanted to play a ghost. Something unsettling and real. So she'd gone digging through local history. Found obscure references to an unsolved missing person case from decades ago. Lena Corbin, drama student, disappeared during a storm. The case had generated a local legend, whispers of a ghost haunting the coastal highway, a woman in the rain looking for a ride home. Margot had thought it was perfect, tragic and atmospheric. She'd based her entire character on it, the waterlogged appearance, the cryptic phrases about the cold and the deep, even the lullaby. She'd made up the melody herself, just 3 lines, something that sounded old and haunting. But Lena Corbin hadn't been a legend. She'd been real, and Eli Valen had killed her. Margot looked at the photograph again, holding it close to the flashlight. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now that she was looking for it. The same dark hair, the same pale skin, the same build. She and Lena could have been sisters. Could have been the same person. The same white shirt soaked through. The same jeans. The same bare feet on hardwood floors. Margot's breath caught. She hadn't planned any of that. The white shirt had been a coincidence. It was just what she'd been wearing when her car broke down. The jeans were hers. She'd kicked off her shoes because they were soaked and uncomfortable. She'd improvised the water trails using bottles from her bag, but she hadn't known, couldn't have known, that this was how Lena had looked the night she died. And the lullaby, the 3-line melody she'd invented. Had she really invented it? Or had she pulled it from somewhere deeper? Some fragment of local memory, some echo that had survived in the collective unconsciousness of the coast. Hush now, hush. The same words Lena had hummed. According to Eli's journal, the same melody. Margot's skin prickled. She thought of Eli's face in those final moments, the way his expression had collapsed from anger to terror to something beyond terror. Recognition. He hadn't died of fear. He'd died of guilt, of the past returning in perfect detail, 30 years of suppression, detonating in a single instant. She gathered the papers with shaking hands, stuffing them back into the broken box. The journal, the clippings, the locket. Evidence. The police would need evidence. They'd need to know what he'd done, what he'd been. The crime he'd buried beneath. decades of success and acclaim. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease. The rain had softened to a steady patter, the wind no longer screaming against the windows. In a few hours, the county crews would clear the mudslide. Someone would come. She'd have to explain why she was here, why Eli Valen was dead on his living room floor. But first she had to look at him again. Had to see what she'd accidentally become. Margot walked back to the living room, flashlight in hand. Eli lay where he'd fallen, his body already stiffening. She knelt beside him, studying his face. In death, he looked smaller, ordinary. Just a man who'd lived too long with a secret that should have destroyed him decades ago. She reached out and closed his eyes, her hand steady now. Then she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness where the ocean waited, invisible but present. Somewhere down there, Lena Corbin's bones rested on the sea floor, worn smooth by 30 years of current. No burial, no marker. Just cold and dark and silence. Margot pressed her forehead against the glass. The locket was still in her hand, warm from her palm. She opened it again, looking at the photograph. Lena smiled up at her, frozen in a moment, before she understood what was coming. And in the window's reflection, Margot saw herself. Dark hair, pale skin, wide eyes, the same white shirt still damp, the same jeans, the same face, the same ghost. The police arrived at dawn, their vehicles grinding up the gravel drive as gray light filtered through the dissipating clouds. Margot met them at the door, her voice steady as she explained what had happened. The broken-down car, Eli's offer of help, the mudslide, the storm, his collapse, a heart attack, sudden and fatal. She'd tried to find a phone to call for help, but the power was out and the landlines were dead. They took her statement. They examined the body. They asked the expected questions, and she gave them expected answers. And through it all, she kept her face composed, her hands still, her voice level. Believable, ordinary, innocent. Just a young woman caught in unfortunate circumstances. A good Samaritan who'd tried to help. She didn't mention the performance. Didn't mention the water or the bare feet or the singing. Those details belonged to something that hadn't happened, a story that ended differently than this one. But when they asked if she'd found anything unusual in the house, she handed them the wooden box. The detective had a coffee stain on his collar and read the journal entries with the slow deliberation of someone who'd seen too much. His expression stayed flat as he sifted through the contents, the clippings, the locket, the photographs. He read in silence for a long time, his jaw tightening with each page. Where did you find this? Margot told him about the hidden office, about the box falling, about reading enough to understand what it contained. The detective closed the box and looked at her with something that might have been sympathy or might have been suspicion. It was hard to tell. You sure you didn't know about any of this before tonight? Margot said. I'd never met him before he picked me up on the highway. I didn't know anything about him, except his name. It was true in the way that mattered. She'd been an actor playing a ghost, nothing more, nothing less. She hadn't known Eli Valen had killed Lena Corbin. She'd only known the legend, the ghost story, the tragedy that had been reduced to campfire fodder. The detective nodded slowly. We'll need you to come to the station, give a formal statement, but you're not in any trouble. You understand that? Margot nodded. She understood perfectly. She was the witness, the discoverer, the person who had accidentally solved a 30-year-old murder by stumbling into the wrong house during a storm. She would be interviewed, thanked, possibly even recognized for bringing closure to a cold case. She would not be suspected. They let her sit in one of the police vehicles while they worked, the heater running, a blanket around her shoulders. Through the window, she watched them moving through Eli's house, photographing everything, bagging evidence, talking in low voices. The sun rose higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds, turning the ocean visible and ordinary once more. A female officer with a voice that suggested years of delivering bad news brought her coffee and asked if there was anyone she wanted to call. Margot said no, there wasn't anyone. She'd been on her way to a friend's house, she explained, but she'd give them a different address, stay somewhere else for a few days. She'd need time to process what had happened. The officer nodded sympathetically and left her alone. Margot sipped the coffee and watched the house. From this angle, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. Beautiful, modern, expensive. The kind of place that appeared in architecture magazines. The kind of place that suggested success and taste and control. Not the kind of place where a man kept trophies of murder hidden in a locked box. Not the kind of place where guilt could fester for 30 years, waiting for the perfect coincidence to detonate it. But that was the thing about houses. They only looked like what you expected them to be, until you opened the wrong door. The detective returned an hour later and told her she was free to go. They'd be in touch for the formal statement, but for now she should go home, rest, take care of herself. He handed her a card with his number and told her to call if she remembered anything else. Margot thanked him and asked if someone could give her a ride back to her car. The highway was clear now, the mudslide gone, and she wanted to see if it would start. Maybe the battery had just needed time to dry out. A young officer drove her in silence, the patrol car winding down the mountain road to the coast highway. Her Honda was still there on the shoulder, hood propped open, exactly as she'd left it. The officer pulled up behind it. He suggested she try starting it before he left. Sometimes batteries just needed time to settle, he said. It happened. Margot nodded and climbed out, though she knew it was pointless. The battery had been completely dead last night, wouldn't even turn over. She'd checked it twice before giving up and flagging down Eli's Range Rover. There was no reason it would work now. She slid behind the wheel and turned the key, already forming an apology, already preparing to ask the officer for a jump or a tow. The engine roared to life on the first try. Margot's hands froze on the wheel. Her breath caught. The Honda idled smoothly, perfectly, as though nothing had ever been wrong with it, as though it had never been dead at all. In the rearview mirror, the officer gave her a satisfied wave and pulled away, his taillights disappearing down the highway. Margot sat in the sudden silence, her heart hammering. She looked at the ignition, at her trembling hands, at the dashboard gauges all reading normal. The car had started, just like that. After 12 hours of sitting in a storm with a dead battery, it had started on the first try. She thought of Eli picking her up, of the mudslide that had appeared exactly when it would force him to take her to his house, of the power going out the moment they arrived, of every small coincidence that had aligned perfectly to bring her to that living room at that exact moment, wearing that exact outfit, humming that exact melody. Mechanical failure, or something else. Margot's hands were shaking as she gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. She forced herself to breathe. It was just a car, just a battery, just chance. But she couldn't quite make herself believe it. She waited until he was out of sight. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the locket. She'd slipped it into her pocket when the detective wasn't looking, just before handing over the box. Just one thing, one small piece of evidence that wouldn't be missed among all the rest. The police had the journal, they had the clippings. They had enough to prove what Eli had done. The locket wouldn't change anything, wouldn't solve anything, wouldn't bring Lena back. But it had been Lena's, and now it was hers. Margot opened it one last time, studying the photograph. Lena Corbin smiled up at her from 30 years ago, young and alive and unaware that she had less than a year left, unaware that she would spend eternity at the bottom of the ocean, unmourned and unfound, reduced to legend, until last night. Margot closed the locket and fastened the chain around her neck. The metal was cold against her skin, but it would warm. Everything warmed eventually. She put the car in gear and pulled onto the highway, heading south. The ocean stretched out beside her, vast and gray and unchanging. Somewhere beneath those waves, Lena's bones shifted with the current, finally at rest now that the truth had surfaced. Or perhaps not. Perhaps rest wasn't possible even now. Perhaps some things stayed cold forever, no matter how much time passed. Margot touched the locket, feeling its weight. She would never know whether she'd chosen the white shirt deliberately or by accident. Whether she'd researched Lena's story so thoroughly that the details had seeped into her subconscious, shaping her performance without her awareness. Whether the lullaby had been her own invention or something she'd heard once and forgotten, carrying it forward like an echo. She would never know whether she'd killed Eli Valen or whether Lena Corbin had. The melody rose in her throat before she realized it was happening. Soft at first, barely audible over the engine and the wind, she felt it forming in her chest, vibrating against her vocal cords, notes that seemed to hum themselves without conscious thought. Hush now, hush. Margot's breath caught. She pressed her lips together, trying to stop it, but the tune kept coming. Not out loud anymore, but inside her head, playing on an endless loop. The same 3 lines, the same rhythm, over and over. She opened her mouth to say something, anything to break the pattern, but when she tried to speak, only the melody emerged, rasping and soft and terrible. Down to the deep, down to sleep. Her hands tightened on the wheel. She tried humming a different song, something bright and modern. Something that belonged to her and not to a woman who'd been dead for 30 years. But the notes wouldn't come. There was only one melody now, only one song. The cold dark is waiting. The cold dark knows. Margot drove south along the coast highway, the locket cold against her throat, and the song playing endlessly in her mind. The ocean stretched beside her, vast and gray and unchanging. Somewhere beneath those waves, Lena Corbin's bones rested on the seafloor. Or perhaps they didn't rest at all. Perhaps rest wasn't possible when you'd been murdered and forgotten and reduced to legend. Perhaps some things stayed cold forever, no matter how much time passed. And perhaps, when the perfect vessel appeared, the same dark hair, the same pale skin, the same desperate need to prove something. Perhaps those cold things found a way to rise again. Margot touched the locket, and in her head, in a voice that might have been hers or might have been someone else's entirely, the lullaby continued. Hush now, hush. The shadows in the corner by the radiator didn't move right. Naomi Lawson sat on the floor of her new apartment, coffee mug gone cold between her palms, half-unpacked boxes forming a cardboard perimeter around her, and stared at the space where darkness pooled like something with weight. The afternoon light came through the windows, gray and thin, the way Seattle light always came in October, but it shouldn't have stopped so completely at that corner. The wall there was the same cream color as every other wall. The floor was the same scuffed hardwood. But when she looked away and looked back, the darkness seemed a fraction of an inch deeper. She set the mug down carefully. Her hands were steady. She'd been proud of how steady they'd stayed through the whole process of packing up the old place, hiring the movers, signing the lease on this converted brick building in Ballard, But now, sitting here in this new space that was supposed to be a fresh start, she couldn't stop staring at that corner. The apartment was a studio, one large room with a galley kitchen tucked into an alcove and a bathroom behind a door that didn't quite hang straight. The building dated back to the 20s, all thick walls and high ceilings and windows that rattled when the wind came off the locks. Her friend Rachel, who worked at the coffee shop on Market Street, had told her about the vacancy. Cheap rent because the landlord couldn't be bothered to renovate. But it had good light, and it was far enough from the old neighborhood that she didn't have to worry about running into people who would ask how she was doing with that specific tone. She stood up and walked to the corner. 3 steps. The shadows didn't move. When she got close enough to touch the wall, she could see it was just a corner. Just 2 walls meeting at an angle. Nothing unusual. But standing there, she felt the hairs on her arms lift, and her breath came shorter, and some animal part of her brain whispered that corners like this were where predators waited. She put her hand flat against the wall. The plaster was cool and slightly gritty under her palm. Solid, real. Nothing wrong with it at all. She went back to unpacking. Books on the particle board shelf, clothes in the shallow closet, television on a milk crate. Normal things, ordinary tasks. The kind of forward motion that was supposed to constitute a life. But every few minutes she found herself looking at the corner again, checking to see if the darkness had grown, if something was forming there in the space where light refused to go. And every time she looked, the corner was exactly as it had been before. Too dark, too still. Wrong in a way she couldn't name but could feel in her bones. By evening, when the gray daylight faded and the streetlights came on outside, she'd finished most of the unpacking. The studio looked almost livable now, almost like a place where a person could exist without feeling like they were camping in someone else's life. She made herself eat something, crackers and cheese standing at the kitchen counter. Food was just texture and temperature now, something she'd put in her mouth because bodies needed fuel. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. Night came fully. The building settled into its evening sounds. Footsteps above, television murmuring through the wall, heating pipes beginning their metallic conversation. Naomi pulled the mattress out and arranged it on the floor near the window. She hadn't bought a bed frame yet. The apartment felt temporary, even though she'd signed a year lease. She lay down with the lamp on, staring at the ceiling where cracks in the plaster formed patterns that looked almost deliberate. Someone walked down the hallway outside, their footsteps heavy and slow. A door opened and closed, then silence. She reached over and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the studio, broken only by the orange glow of the streetlight outside. Her eyes adjusted slowly. She could make out the shapes of her furniture, the boxes she hadn't unpacked yet, the bathroom door standing slightly ajar, and in the corner by the radiator, the darkness was absolute. No hint of the wall behind it. Just a vertical column of black that seemed to swallow any light that touched it. She closed her eyes. She was always tired now, an exhaustion that lived in her bones. But lying here in the dark, she couldn't stop thinking about the corner, couldn't stop imagining what might be forming there. She opened her eyes. The corner was darker than before. She sat up slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster. She reached for the lamp, found the switch, turned it. Light flooded the studio. The corner by the radiator was empty. Just wall and floor and baseboard heater. Nothing there. She lay back down but kept the lamp on. She stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that she was just stressed, just exhausted. The corner was fine. The shadows were normal. There was nothing in her apartment except her own fear. That night she woke at 3 a.m. with her heart slamming against her ribs and her mouth tasting like rust. The room was dark except for the orange glow from outside. She lay on the mattress and listened to the building settle. The radiator ticked. Someone's television murmured. Outside, a car passed with its bass rattling the windows, and from the corner by the radiator came a sound like someone trying very hard not to sob. She held completely still. The sound was wet and ragged and quiet. The kind of crying that happens when someone has been crying for so long they've lost the ability to make noise properly. It hitched and caught and restarted. It didn't stop. She reached out slowly and found the lamp. Her fingers closed around the switch. She turned it. The light came on, filling the studio with 60 watts of yellow incandescence. The corner by the radiator was empty. Just wall and floor and geometric angles. No one there. But the weeping continued for another 5 seconds, fading by degrees like someone walking away down a long hallway before it stopped entirely. She sat up and pulled her knees to her chest. She didn't turn the lamp off. She didn't sleep. She sat there watching the corner until the gray daylight came back and the building woke up around her. In the morning, when she finally stood up from the mattress, she found the letter on her bed. It sat on the pillow next to where her head had been, a single sheet of lined paper torn from a spiral notebook, folded once. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, letters slanting in different directions, like whoever had written it had been doing it in the dark or with hands that didn't work right. The ink was black, slightly smeared. She unfolded it. I watch you sleep. Your mouth opens slightly and your breathing changes just before you dream. You turned over twice last night, and the second time you made a small sound like a question. I was 3 feet away. You didn't know I was there, but you will. Naomi read it 3 times. The words stayed exactly what they were. Specific, intimate, impossible. She looked at the pillow, at the indentation where her head had been, at the space of maybe 6 inches between where she'd been sleeping and where this letter had been placed. Someone had been in her apartment while she slept. She dropped the paper. It fluttered to the hardwood floor. Her hands weren't steady anymore. They shook when she picked it up again, and they kept shaking when she checked the door. Locked, chain engaged, and the windows. Locked, screens intact. She checked the bathroom even though the door had been closed all night, and there was nowhere to hide. No one could have gotten in. The building had buzzers and locked entry doors, and she was on the 3rd floor. No fire escape outside her window, no balcony, no ledge wide enough to stand on. But someone had gotten in. Someone had stood next to her while she slept, and left this letter and disappeared without making a sound. She sat on the edge of the mattress with the letter in her lap and looked at the corner by the radiator. The morning light came through the window, gray and thin, and the corner looked normal in that light. But she could still hear the weeping in her memory, and she understood that something was in her apartment. Something that could move without being seen and write letters while she slept. She stood up. Her legs felt unsteady but held her weight. She got dressed and left the apartment, walked down the 3 flights of stairs and out into the October morning. Normal people doing normal things, living normal lives that didn't include letters on their pillows or weeping from empty corners. She walked for an hour with no destination in mind. Eventually her feet hurt, and her body started shaking from hunger, and she had to go back. She climbed the 3 flights slowly, unlocked her door, and stepped inside and engaged the chain lock, even though she knew it hadn't stopped anyone the night before. The studio looked exactly as she'd left it. The letter was still on the floor. The corner was still too dark. She picked up the letter and read it again. The words were the same. Just that intimate, specific observation about how she slept, how she moved, how she made small sounds that someone had been close enough to hear. She thought about calling the police, but didn't. Instead, she went to the hardware store and bought additional locks, a deadbolt, a heavier chain, rubber wedges to jam under the door at night. She installed them herself with a screwdriver from the toolbox David had put together years ago. Her hand shook the whole time, but she got the locks installed. Then she went to the windows and checked them again. Old wooden frames with sash weights, simple rotating latches. She tested each one. On the fire escape next door, she could see rust and bird droppings, evidence that no one had used it in years. The apartment was secure. By any reasonable standard, no one should be able to get inside while she slept. And yet the letter proved that someone had. She sat on the mattress and stared at the corner and tried to think of an explanation that made sense. Maybe she'd been sleepwalking and had written the letter herself, though she'd never sleepwalked in her life and the handwriting looked nothing like her own. Or maybe something was in her apartment that didn't need doors or windows. Something that lived in the dark corners and could manifest when light failed. She pulled her knees to her chest and watched the corner as afternoon light faded and evening came on and the shadows began to gather again. The second letter appeared after 3 days. Naomi had been existing in a state of hypervigilance that made her feel like her skin was too thin. She left lamps on all the time now, every light burning even during the day. She'd bought more lamps at the thrift store. Cheap ones with weak bulbs, but they pushed back the shadows in every corner, except the one by the radiator. That corner stayed dark no matter how much light she aimed at it. She'd set up a desk lamp on the floor pointed directly at the space, but the darkness there seemed to swallow the light. She hadn't slept more than an hour or two at a stretch. She'd lie on the mattress with her eyes open, watching the corner, waiting. Sometimes she'd see it. Not movement exactly, but a thickening, a suggestion of verticality where the darkness collected itself, tall, impossibly tall. So thin it seemed to be made of lines rather than mass. And always just at the edge of hearing, the wet, ragged sound of weeping. The second letter was on the kitchen counter when she came back from the bathroom one morning. 3 minutes, brushing her teeth, washing her face. When she came out, the letter was there, folded once, sitting next to the coffee mug she'd left. She picked it up. Same jagged handwriting, same black ink, slightly smeared. You stood in front of the refrigerator for 43 seconds this morning before you remembered what you wanted. You do that often. You stand very still, and your eyes go somewhere else. I wonder where you go. I wonder if you're trying to go back to before. You can't. I won't let you. Naomi read it twice. Then she checked every hiding place. Bathroom, empty. Closet, her few clothes, nothing behind them. Under the mattress. Just floor. Behind the furniture. Nothing but dust. Nothing. No one. She was alone. Except that she wasn't. Someone had been here while she was in the bathroom. Someone had placed this letter. Had observed her standing blank in front of the refrigerator that morning. Someone was watching her all the time, noting the small moments of her dissolution. She put the letter on top of the first one. 2 letters now, 2 pieces of evidence. The third letter appeared that night, tucked under her coffee mug on the floor next to her mattress. She'd gotten up to use the bathroom at 2 in the morning, and when she came back, the letter was there. Folded once, waiting. The way you hold your left hand when you think no one's watching. The way you rub your ring finger with your thumb. There's a pale band of skin there that hasn't tanned. You took the ring off, but you still reach for it. I see you do it. I'm always seeing you. She couldn't speak. She looked at her left hand, at the pale band on her ring finger, where David's wedding band had sat for 9 years. She'd taken it off 6 months after he died, when wearing it had started to feel like clinging to something that was gone and never coming back. She'd put it in a shoebox under the mattress, along with other things she couldn't quite throw away. She did rub that spot on her finger. She did it without thinking. a gesture, so automatic she barely noticed anymore. But someone else had noticed. Someone had been watching her closely enough to see this small, private habit. She set the letter down next to the others. Her hands were shaking so badly, the paper rattled. 3 letters, 3 intrusions, 3 pieces of evidence that whatever was in her apartment knew her, was studying her, was documenting the small, private gestures she made when she thought she was alone. The 4th letter appeared the next morning on the closed toilet lid when she came out of the shower. You smell like soap and fear. The fear is new. Before I came, you smelled like nothing at all, like you were barely here. I'm making you real again. You should thank me. Naomi read it, standing there naked and dripping, the bathroom mirror fogged from steam. The letter was slightly damp, as though whoever had placed it there had done so while she was still in the shower, while water was still running, while she'd been inches away behind a translucent curtain. She dropped the letter and pulled the shower curtain fully open. Nothing there but tile wall. She checked behind the door. She checked under the sink. Nothing. No one. But someone had been here. Close enough to place a letter, close enough to smell her. She got dressed quickly, her wet skin making the clothes stick. She gathered all 4 letters and spread them out on the desk in chronological order. A sequence, a progression. Each one more intimate than the last. The watcher in her apartment, whatever it was, whoever it was, knew her. Knew her habits, her gestures, her history. Knew about the ring and the grief and the way that she stood blank in front of the refrigerator. Naomi made a decision. If locks and windows couldn't keep this thing out, maybe older methods would work. She went to a store in the university district that sold crystals and sage bundles and books about protective rituals. The woman behind the counter listened to Naomi's careful explanation about feeling uneasy in her new apartment. The woman sold her white sage, sea salt, and a piece of black tourmaline. She explained how to smudge the apartment, how to create a protective barrier with salt, how to place the stone where negative energy accumulated. That evening, as the light failed, Naomi followed the instructions. She lit the sage bundle and walked through the studio, letting the smoke drift into every corner. The smoke made her eyes water and caught in her throat, but she kept going until the entire apartment was hazy with it. Then she took the sea salt and poured a line across her doorway, a barrier between the hallway and her home. She poured another line across the bathroom threshold. She created a circle of salt around her mattress, a protected space where she could sleep. Finally, she placed the black tourmaline in the corner by the radiator, right in the center of that space where darkness gathered. The stone looked small and insignificant sitting there, but the woman had promised it would absorb negative energy. Naomi stepped back and surveyed her work. The apartment smelled like sage smoke. White lines of salt gleamed on the floor. The black stone sat in the corner like a guardian. She felt better. For the first time in days, she felt like she'd done something that might actually work. Physical locks hadn't stopped the intruder, but maybe these older protections would. She went to bed that night with a small flicker of hope. She lay on her mattress inside the circle of salt and waited for sleep. The weeping started just after midnight. That wet, ragged sound filling the studio, coming from the corner by the radiator where the black stone sat uselessly. Naomi's eyes snapped open, and she looked at the salt circle around her mattress. Unbroken. Perfectly intact. The white line glowing faintly in the orange streetlight from outside. The weeping continued. And then movement in the dark. Naomi sat up slowly. The corner was darker than before, the darkness pooling and gathering, forming itself into a shape. Tall, impossibly tall. 7 feet at least, maybe more. Thin in a way that violated anatomy. All vertical lines and sharp angles. The weeping man stood in his corner, and the black tourmaline sat at his feet like an offering, and the sage smoke had done nothing, and the salt lines were intact and useless because he hadn't needed to cross them. He'd been here all along. He'd never left. He didn't need to enter through doors or windows because he lived in the apartment itself, in the corners, in the shadows. Naomi looked at the salt circle around her mattress, perfectly intact, not a single grain disturbed. She looked at the doorway. The salt line there was also unbroken. And yet a new letter sat on the floor just outside her protective circle, folded once, waiting. She understood then. The protection hadn't failed. It had revealed the truth. Whatever was writing these letters didn't need to break barriers because it was already inside, had always been inside. She reached out slowly and picked up the letter. Her hand passed through the salt circle, breaking it, rendering it meaningless. She unfolded the paper. I don't need doors. I don't need windows. I'm already here. I've always been here. Stop trying to keep me out. Naomi let the letter fall. She looked at the weeping man standing in his corner, at the black stone sitting useless at his feet, at the sage smoke still hanging in the air, all of it meaningless, all of it irrelevant, because the threat wasn't external. The weeping man tilted his head, watching her with the absence where eyes should be, and for the first time, Naomi heard his voice. Not words spoken aloud, but knowledge appearing in her mind fully formed, thoughts that weren't hers being written directly into her consciousness. You're trying so hard to fight me, but you're fighting the wrong battle. I'm not your enemy. Her voice wouldn't come. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only sit there inside her broken salt circle while the entity in the corner spoke directly into her brain. But even as the words appeared in her mind, she noticed something. The voice felt familiar. The cadence, the rhythm, the particular way the thoughts were structured. It reminded her of her own internal monologue, of the way she talked to herself in the privacy of her own head. She pushed the observation away, focused on the immediate threat, on the thing standing in her corner, weeping black tears that ran upward toward the ceiling in defiance of gravity. The weeping man stepped forward. 1 step. 2. He moved in a way that didn't match normal locomotion, his body gliding across the floor. He stopped 6 feet from her mattress, just outside where the salt circle had been. Naomi's body wanted to run. Every animal instinct screamed at her to move, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment was small, the door was across the room, and she understood that running wouldn't help. You couldn't run from something that lived in corners and shadows. The weeping man extended one long shadow hand toward her. The fingers were impossibly long, tapering to points that looked sharp enough to cut. He held his hand there, palm up, as though offering something or asking for something in return. Naomi stared at that hand, at the way it was made of thousands of fine lines of darkness woven together, all of them trembling lightly. She thought about the letters, about the specific observations, about how he knew her habits and gestures. She thought about his voice appearing in her mind, sounding like her own thoughts. She thought about the salt line that hadn't been crossed because he'd never needed to cross it. The weeping man's hand remained extended, waiting, patient as stone. Naomi didn't take it. She pulled her knees to her chest and watched him. And gradually, slowly, he lowered his hand and stepped back into his corner and dissolved into the shadows there. The weeping continued for another hour before it finally faded. Naomi sat on her mattress, surrounded by the remains of her broken protections, and understood that she was dealing with something physical barriers couldn't stop. In the morning, she swept up the salt, threw away the sage bundle, put the black tourmaline in a drawer, None of it had worked because she'd been trying to solve the wrong problem. The question wasn't how to keep the weeping man out. The question was what he was and why he was here. The letters came faster after that. She'd find them everywhere. Between book pages inside the refrigerator, slipped under her pillow, placed on the bathroom counter. The handwriting got worse with each one. More erratic. You stopped eating 3 days ago. Good. You're starting to understand. The body is just weight. When it gets light enough, you'll float away with me. Somewhere without corners, without walls. Just darkness and weeping and us. I counted your heartbeats last night. 7,412. Each one a small defiance. Each one a small betrayal. I'll count them all until they stop. The ring is in the shoebox under your mattress. You haven't opened it since you moved in. But you think about it 60, 70 times a day. You think if you don't look at it, it's not real. I could show you what's real. She stopped reading them after a while. She'd find them and leave them face down, unread. But she knew they were accumulating, documenting in jagged handwriting the way she was coming apart day by day, hour by hour, heartbeat by heartbeat. The weeping got louder. She could hear it all the time now, not just at night, but during the day, a constant background lie. The corner by the radiator had become the center of her apartment, the point around which everything else organized itself. She couldn't turn her back on it, couldn't position herself anywhere where that corner wasn't in her line of sight. And the darkness was gathering. It was getting darker, denser, more substantial. Where before it had been a column of shadow, now it was beginning to have texture, dimension. She could make out vertical lines within it, striations that suggested structure. The shape was tall, 7 feet at least, maybe taller, too tall to be human, too thin. All vertical lines and sharp angles. She tried to leave. 3 times in one afternoon, she walked to the door, unlocked the deadbolt, unhooked the chain, put her hand on the doorknob. And 3 times her vision tunneled, her breath shortened, and her legs stopped working. The thought of opening that door and walking down the hallway made her chest compress with something that felt like terror. It was easier to stay inside, easier to exist in this small space where at least she knew what the threat was. The first time she saw him fully, it was almost a relief. She'd been lying on the mattress in the middle of the night, lamp on, staring at the ceiling. The weeping had been going for hours. She turned her head slowly and looked at the corner by the radiator. The weeping man stood there. He was impossibly tall, his head nearly touching the ceiling. 7 feet, 8 feet. Height that shouldn't fit in a room with 8-foot ceilings, but somehow did, as though the space bent around him. He was thin in a way that violated basic anatomy, all vertical lines and sharp angles, his body the color of shadow made solid. Not black exactly, more like the absence of light given form. His face was barely a suggestion. She could make out where eyes might be, where a mouth should exist, but the features were more implied than present. And from those spaces where eyes might be came 2 streaks of liquid, black and viscous, tracking down the nothing of his face. The tears didn't fall. They ran upward, defying gravity, pulled toward the ceiling. He stood perfectly still except for the trembling that ran through his too thin frame, a vibration that matched the rhythm of the weeping, as though his entire body was an instrument playing this one sustained note of grief. His hands, if they could be called hands, hung at his sides, fingers twice as long as human fingers should be, tapering to points that looked sharp enough to cut. Naomi couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. Some primal part of her brain screamed that if she moved, he would cross the room faster than thought, and those long, terrible fingers would touch her, and she would never be the same. The weeping man tilted his head. The motion was wrong, too precise, too deliberate, like a bird of prey tracking movement. The black tears kept streaming upward, and the sound of his weeping filled the studio until it was the only sound in the world. And then, without moving his mouth, he spoke. The voice didn't come from his body. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from inside her head and from the walls themselves. But this time, the words that appeared in her mind had a quality she hadn't noticed before. They felt like her own thoughts, but twisted. You're pathetic, you know that? Look at you. Lying here in the dark, too afraid to move, too broken to function. No wonder, David. She flinched. The thought cut off abruptly, but the damage was done. Because that voice, that cadence, those specific words, she'd thought them before. She'd had that exact thought about herself maybe 100 times since David died. That internal voice that told her she was failing, that she was broken. But she'd never thought that voice might be anything other than her own harsh self-assessment. She'd never considered that it might be something else speaking to her using her own vocabulary, her own rhythm, her own cruelty turned back on itself. The weeping man stood motionless in his corner, watching her with the absence where eyes should be. And Naomi understood that his voice appearing in her mind wasn't just supernatural intrusion. It was something worse. It was her own thoughts being mimicked back to her, twisted, just enough to feel wrong, but not enough to be immediately recognizable as foreign. How long had he been doing this? How many of her thoughts had actually been his thoughts placed in her mind? The weeping man tilted his head again. And this time, when his voice came, it was softer, almost gentle, but still wearing the cadence of her own thoughts. I will never leave you. I will take away every single thing you love until there is nothing left in your life but me. And then you'll understand. Then you'll finally understand what you are. The lamp went out. Not the bulb burning out. She could see the filament still glowing faintly. But her vision collapsing inward, tunneling down to nothing. She was blind in the dark with the weeping man, and the weeping got louder and louder until she thought her skull would split from the pressure. She tried to scream. Her mouth open, no sound came out. Air wouldn't move through her chest. Her body had stopped working. She was just consciousness trapped in meat. And the weeping man was leaning closer, and she could smell him now, salt and copper and something underneath that was older, colder, like stones at the bottom of a winter lake. And then she felt it, something impossible. A single fingertip, impossibly cold, traced the curve of her ear, not roughly, not violently, almost tenderly, as though the weeping man was memorizing the shape of her through touch. The cold was absolute. Not the cold of ice, but the cold of deep space. It burned without fire. It ached in her bones. The finger traced down from her ear to her jaw. A touch so light it was barely there, and yet it felt like it was leaving a mark. Like everywhere he touched would be permanently changed. Naomi's body had stopped obeying her entirely. She couldn't pull away, couldn't flinch. Couldn't do anything but lie there while the weeping man touched her face with that single, impossibly cold finger. And the worst part was that under the terror, under the revulsion, she felt something else. She felt known, seen, acknowledged in a way she hadn't been since David died. The finger lifted away. Her vision came back gradually, the lamp brightening until the studio was lit again. The corner by the radiator was empty. Just wall and floor and radiator. The weeping man was gone. But Naomi could still feel where he'd touched her. The cold had sunk into her skin, into her bone. She raised her hand to her ear, to her jaw, tracing the path his finger had taken. Her own touch felt warm by comparison. She sat up slowly. Her body ached. as though she'd been holding a single position for hours. She looked at the corner and tried to process what had just happened. He'd touched her. The weeping man had reached out and touched her, had made physical contact. Or had he? The question arrived quietly, insidiously. Because now, sitting here in the lamplight, trying to remember exactly what had happened, she couldn't be entirely sure. The touch had felt real. The cold had been absolute. But memory was unreliable, especially memory formed in moments of extreme fear. What if she'd touched herself? What if, in her terror and exhaustion, she'd reached up and traced her own ear, her own jaw, and the cold she'd felt was just her own fingers, her own circulation compromised by fear and stress. The thought was almost worse than believing the weeping man had touched her. Because if she'd touched herself and couldn't remember doing it, if her body was taking actions without her conscious awareness, then what else might she be doing in these gaps of consciousness? She looked at her hands. They were shaking. They were always shaking now. She studied them as though they belonged to someone else, trying to see them as instruments that might betray her. The corner by the radiator stayed empty for the rest of the night. But Naomi didn't sleep. She sat on her mattress and watched that space, and she touched her ear, her jaw, over and over, trying to remember if the cold was real or manufactured, trying to understand if the threat was outside her or inside her, or somehow both at once. In the morning, when the gray daylight came back, she found a new letter on her pillow. You felt me. You know I'm real now. Stop pretending this is all in your mind. She read it 3 times. The handwriting was the same jagged scrawl, but now, looking at it in the morning light, she thought she could see something familiar in the way certain letters were formed. The way the T crossed just a fraction too high. The way the Y descended with a slight curve to the left. Little details that reminded her of her own handwriting but distorted, as though written with her non-dominant hand or while her hand was trembling. She folded the letter carefully and added it to the growing pile. 37 letters now. 37 pieces of paper, all with the same jagged handwriting. 37 pieces of evidence that she couldn't trust anymore, because now she'd started to wonder who was really writing them. Rachel came by on a Wednesday afternoon using the spare key Naomi had given her weeks ago. Naomi heard the key in the lock and sat up from where she'd been lying on the mattress. And when the door opened and Rachel stepped into the studio, the expression on her friend's face told Naomi everything about what she must look like. Rachel stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene. The lights burning everywhere, even though it was afternoon. The letters scattered across the floor, maybe 40 of them now, on the unmade mattress. The boxes still half unpacked. The smell, stale air, an unwashed body, and something else underneath. Something that smelled like salt water and old tears. And Naomi herself, sitting in the center of it all, in clothes she'd been wearing for days, her hair unwashed and tangled, her eyes sunken and red-rimmed, her body so thin now that her collarbone stood out sharp beneath her shirt. Rachel closed the door behind her. She didn't move further into the apartment. She just stood there and looked at Naomi with an expression that was carefully controlled. They looked at each other for a long time. Naomi wanted to explain, but couldn't find words that wouldn't sound insane. Rachel broke the silence first. Her voice was gentle but firm. Naomi, you can't stay here. Naomi gestured toward the corner by the radiator, but couldn't make herself say anything about what lived there. Rachel looked at the corner. Her face stayed carefully neutral. She walked across the studio and stood directly in the space where the weeping man appeared each night. She waved her hand through the air, demonstrating its emptiness. Nothing here, just a corner. It's darker than the rest of the room because the radiator blocks some of the light. but there's nothing wrong with it. Naomi knew what Rachel was seeing. Just a corner, just an ordinary space. The weeping man only appeared for Naomi, only manifested when she was alone, and even then, only when he chose to. Rachel walked back to the mattress and sat down next to Naomi. She didn't touch her, didn't try to put an arm around her shoulders. She just sat close enough that Naomi could feel her warmth. "I think we need to call your doctor, or maybe we should go to the hospital, just to make sure you're okay. This isn't you, Naomi. I don't know what's happening, but you're not okay. And I'm watching you disappear, and I don't know how to help you." Naomi looked at the letters scattered across the floor. Physical evidence, real and tangible. She could pick one up right now and show Rachel the handwriting. But she didn't. Because yesterday morning she'd tried to read one of the letters and had realized, with a sick lurch in her stomach, that she recognized the handwriting. Not as her own, exactly. It was too jagged, too erratic, but as something adjacent to her own, as though someone had taken her hand and forced it to write while she was unconscious. She didn't want to think about what that meant. Rachel stood up. "Come with me, just for today. We'll get you out of here, get you something to eat, and we'll figure out what to do next. You don't have to decide anything right now." Naomi looked at the corner. The weeping man wasn't visible in the afternoon light, but she could sense him there. And in her head, so quiet she almost missed it, she heard his voice, or her voice, or some voice that belonged to both of them and neither of them. "Go ahead. Leave with her. It doesn't matter. I'll be here when you get back. I'll always be here." She stood up. Her legs shook but held her weight. They left together, Rachel's hand on Naomi's elbow, guiding her toward the door. Naomi looked back once before they stepped into the hallway. The corner by the radiator was empty in the daylight. Just wall and floor and radiator, nothing more. But she could still hear the weeping, faint and distant, like someone crying in another apartment. Rachel took her to a diner on Market Street. They sat by the window where gray October light filtered through glass, made wavy with age. Rachel ordered for both of them, eggs and toast and hash browns. Naomi picked at her food while Rachel talked, about work, about the weather, about a movie she'd seen, about anything except the obvious topic of Naomi's deterioration. It was kind in a way. Rachel was giving her space to exist in normalcy for a few hours. But normalcy felt like a costume that didn't fit anymore. Naomi had been wearing it for a year. The costume of a widow who was coping, who was moving forward, who had processed her grief. But sitting here, Naomi realized the costume had never fit properly. She'd just been holding it closed with both hands, refusing to acknowledge how transparent it was. After an hour, Rachel drove her back to the apartment building. She walked Naomi up the 3 flights and all the way to the door, and she didn't leave until Naomi had gone inside and locked the door. Naomi stood in the studio and looked at the corner by the radiator, empty in the late afternoon light. But evening was coming, and when evening came, the weeping man would return. That night, Naomi made a decision. She'd been existing in reactive mode for weeks, just responding without any plan. But if this was going to continue, if the weeping man was real and present and permanent, then she needed to understand him, needed to document him, needed proof. She went to the thrift store the next morning early. The walk there took 20 minutes and felt like crossing a foreign country. She hadn't been outside in days except for yesterday's trip with Rachel. The air felt too big, the sky too open. She kept her head down and walked fast. The thrift store smelled like dust and old fabric and the particular sadness that clings to abandoned objects. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a greenish pall. The electronics section was in the back. Naomi went straight there and found what she was looking for, a camcorder. the kind with the flip-out screen and the tape slot. The man at the register was maybe 60, wearing a flannel shirt with pen stains on the pocket. He pulled the camcorder out of its case and demonstrated that it worked. The tape mechanism made a grinding sound like it was chewing plastic, but the little screen lit up blue and showed Naomi the thrift store in miniature, all compressed and slightly warped. He showed her how to insert the tape with a click that felt cheap but definite, how to press the red button that started recording. $40. She paid in cash and walked back to the apartment with the camcorder in a plastic bag. Back in the studio, she set up the camcorder on the kitchen counter, angled toward the corner by the radiator. She plugged it in so the battery wouldn't die overnight. She adjusted the angle until the frame captured both the corner and the mattress where she slept. She checked the tape, made sure it was rewound, that she had enough recording time. She pressed record. The red light came on. The tape started rolling with that grinding plastic sound. Naomi went to the mattress and lay down. It was early evening, the gray light fading toward dark. She lay there with her eyes closed and her breathing steady, performing sleep, and waited for night to come fully. The weeping started around midnight. Naomi kept her eyes closed and her breathing even, pretending unconsciousness, while the weeping man manifested in his corner. She could feel him watching her, could sense his presence. The temperature dropped. The air got thick and hard to breathe. And then came the sound she'd been waiting for. The soft scrape of pen on paper. She opened her eyes the tiniest fraction, just enough to see through her lashes. The weeping man stood at the foot of her mattress, bent over at an angle that should have been impossible. His long shadow hands held a pen and notebook paper. The black tears dripped from his absent face onto the page, but they didn't blur the ink. He wrote with those impossibly long fingers, precise and careful. 40 seconds. 50. When he finished, he folded the paper once and leaned forward to place it on her pillow. And as he leaned down, his face, that absence of a face, that void where features should be, came close to hers. So close she could feel the cold radiating from him, could smell that salt and copper scent mixed with something like deep ocean. She felt it again, that impossibly cold touch. Not his hand this time, his breath. Except he didn't have breath, didn't have lungs or mouth or any biological machinery. But she felt it anyway. A coldness like winter lakes exhaled across the back of her neck, raising every hair on her body. The touch was intimate and terrible, and somehow tender, as though the weeping man was trying to comfort her even as he terrified her. He placed the letter on her pillow 6 inches from her face. Then he straightened. That impossible unfolding motion, his body extending in segments like a carpenter's rule, and looked directly at her. She knew he knew she was awake, knew he had always known, had been allowing her to witness this, because it didn't matter, because she couldn't stop him. He stepped backward into his corner and dissolved into the shadows there. Naomi counted to 500 before she moved, her neck still cold where his not breath had touched her. Then she sat up slowly and looked at the letter on her pillow. She didn't touch it. She just looked at it, at the familiar fold. She stood and walked to the kitchen counter where the camcorder sat, still recording, red light still on. Her hands were shaking so badly, she almost dropped it twice, but she managed to hold it steady enough to press stop. The grinding sound ceased. She rewound the tape, watching the counter spin backward. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was proof. She pressed play. The small flip-out screen glowed blue in the dark studio. Naomi watched herself lying on the mattress, perfectly still, breathing steadily. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m. The corner by the radiator was empty. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared. And then at 12:43 a.m., Naomi sat up. She watched herself on the screen sit up slowly, stiffly, like a puppet being pulled upright by invisible strings. Her eyes were open, but not seeing, focused on nothing. She watched herself stand and walk across the studio, not to the corner where the weeping man manifested, but to the opposite corner, where she kept her desk with her checkbook and envelopes and pens. She watched herself pull out the desk chair and sit down, pick up a pen, tear a piece of paper from a spiral notebook, start writing. The handwriting visible on the screen was jagged, erratic, exactly like the handwriting in all the letters. Her left hand trembled against the desk surface. Her face remained slack, empty. She wrote for 30 seconds. Then she stopped, folded the paper once, stood, walked to the mattress. And as she walked, she raised her right hand to her own neck, extended one finger, traced the back of her own neck with that single fingertip, her touch light and careful, while her face remained expressionless. Naomi watched herself place the paper on the pillow 6 inches from where her head had been. Watched herself walk back to the mattress. Watched herself lie down and close her eyes. The timestamp read 12:46 a.m., 3 minutes. The entire episode had taken 3 minutes. Naomi watched the rest of the tape. Nothing else moved. The corner stayed empty. She lay, sleeping on the mattress until the tape ran out 45 minutes later. She rewound it, watched it again, and again, each time hoping to see something different, but the footage showed the same thing every time. Her, sleepwalking, writing letters to herself, touching her own neck with her own finger, while her consciousness was somewhere else. The cold breath she'd felt on her neck had been her own touch. The impossibly cold fingertip that had traced her ear days ago had been her own finger. The weeping man didn't need to touch her. She was touching herself, her dissociated hand, creating the sensation of external contact, while her conscious mind experienced it as violation. Naomi sat on the floor with the camcorder in her lap and tried to understand what this meant. The conclusion was inescapable. There was no external entity entering her apartment. There was just her, sleepwalking, dissociating, performing actions she had no conscious memory of. She was writing the letters herself. She was creating the weeping man herself. She was the haunting. The thought was more terrifying than believing in an external threat. Because if her mind had fractured enough to create an entire alternate personality that could take control of her body while she slept, then what else was it capable of? What other gaps existed in her consciousness? Naomi stood and walked to the corner by the radiator. She stood in the space where the weeping man appeared each night and felt nothing. Just cool air and plaster and ordinary shadows. But he would appear again tonight. She knew that with certainty. Because knowing the truth about what he was didn't make him less real. It just changed the nature of the reality. The weeping man was real in the way that psychological phenomena were real. Internal, but with external effects, invisible to others, but devastatingly present to her. She went to the library that afternoon and checked out books on dissociation, trauma, defense mechanisms. She read them sitting on the floor of her studio. The books explained what was happening to her in clinical language that made it sound manageable, treatable. Dissociative identity disorder. The mind splits to survive unbearable trauma. The mind creates separate identities, alters to hold what the whole personality cannot integrate. The alters can take control of the body, can perform actions the main personality has no memory of. The weeping man wasn't an external entity. The weeping man was an alter, a part of her that had split off to carry what she couldn't carry. And what couldn't she carry? What had been so unbearable that her mind had fragmented rather than face it? The book said DID usually formed in childhood in response to severe trauma before the personality fully integrated. But it could form later too if the trauma was profound enough, if the grief was overwhelming enough, if the mind simply couldn't hold the full weight of what had happened. David's death. A year ago, October. The accident, the hospital, the funeral she'd attended but couldn't remember, the months of moving through the world like a ghost, functioning but not feeling. She'd thought she was handling it, thought she was being strong, moving forward, not letting the grief consume her. But her mind had known better. Her mind had understood that the grief was too enormous to carry consciously. So it had created the weeping man to carry it for her, an altar whose only job was to weep, to feel, to remember, to hold the unbearable weight of David's absence while Naomi, who functioned, could continue to exist in the world. She looked at the corner where the weeping man would appear after 3 days, sitting on the floor surrounded by the library books. He was protecting her. By terrorizing her with letters and manifestations and whispered threats, by creating an external threat that felt concrete and fightable. Her fractured mind was trying to give her grief a form she could address, because formless grief, the kind that had no edges, no boundaries, was impossible to fight. But a monster in a corner? That was something you could face. That night, Naomi sat on the mattress and waited for the weeping man to appear. When he manifested in the corner, 7 feet tall and impossibly thin, the black tears streaming upward from his absent face, she looked at him with new understanding. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him she knew what he was now. But before she could say anything, the weeping got louder. So loud she had to press her hands over her ears, but it didn't help because the sound was coming from inside her head. The studio darkened, shadows pulling in from every corner, and the weeping man stepped forward, closer than he'd ever been, close enough that she could see the individual threads of darkness that composed him, could smell the salt and copper and ancient ocean depths. His voice filled her skull, not a whisper now, but a roar, and this time she could hear it clearly. This time she recognized it completely. It was her own voice, her own thoughts, her own words that she'd been thinking for a year, given form and volume, and turned back on her. You don't understand anything. You think knowing what I am changes something? You think understanding the mechanics makes me less real? I'm more real than you are. I'm the only part of you that's actually feeling anything. You're just the shell that goes through motions. I'm the one who's been keeping you alive. The studio went completely dark. Naomi felt the cold emanating from him, felt the weight of his presence, felt the terrible grief he carried. Grief that was hers, that had always been hers, that she'd been refusing to acknowledge for a year. And underneath the grief, something else. Something that felt like love, like desperate protective love. The weeping man wasn't just carrying her grief, he was carrying it away from her, holding it separate, maintaining the wall between Naomi, who functioned, and Naomi, who had been destroyed. He was protecting her. And he would continue protecting her by terrorizing her, by keeping her afraid, because fear was an emotion she could feel without falling apart. Fear was manageable. Fear was something you could survive. But the grief he was holding, that would kill her. I'm not your enemy, the weeping man whispered, his voice, her voice, softer now, almost tender. I'm the only thing keeping you alive. Without me, you'd have to feel everything. You'd have to remember that David is gone and he's never coming back, and you're going to live the rest of your life without him. Could you survive that? Could you wake up every morning and remember that truth and still find a reason to keep breathing? Naomi sat in the darkness and couldn't answer. because she didn't know. She genuinely didn't know if she could survive the full weight of David's absence without this protective split. "I'm not asking you to integrate," the voice continued. "I'm not asking you to take this back. I'm just asking you to accept that I exist, that I'm necessary, that this is the only way you can continue. We can live like this. I'll hold the grief. You hold everything else. We'll share this body and this life, and neither of us has to feel more than we can bear." The darkness lifted gradually. Naomi's vision came back. The weeping man stood in his corner, patient and permanent, and she understood that he was offering her a bargain, a compromise, a way to survive without having to face the full truth of what she'd lost. She could live this way. She'd been living this way for weeks now. It was horrible and exhausting and slowly destroying her, but it was survivable. The alternative? Taking back the grief, feeling it fully, might not be survivable at all. The weeping man was right. Naomi understood this after 3 days, sitting on the floor surrounded by the library books. She'd been reading about dissociative identity disorder, about trauma responses, about fractured consciousness. The clinical language made it sound manageable, just a matter of integration therapy, of slowly reuniting the fractured parts until the whole person could hold all their experiences. But the books were written for cases where the dissociation protected someone from memories that could be processed once the person was in a safe environment. The books weren't written for cases like hers, where the dissociation was protecting her from the present moment, from a grief so enormous that acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that her entire future had been erased. The weeping man wasn't holding a memory. He was holding her reality. And if she integrated with him, she took back the grief he'd been carrying. She wasn't sure there would be enough of her left to survive it. She looked at the corner by the radiator, empty in the afternoon light, but she could sense him there, waiting. He was always waiting, patient as stone. She thought about the promise he'd made, that he would continue to hold the grief, that they could share this body and this life without either of them having to feel more than they could bear. It was a bargain, a way to keep existing without facing the full weight of what had happened. She could live this way, could continue splitting herself between Naomi, who functioned, and the weeping man who carried everything she couldn't carry. It wasn't healing, but maybe healing wasn't possible. Maybe survival was enough. That night, the weeping man appeared as usual. Naomi lay on the mattress and watched him manifest, watched the darkness gather itself into his impossible height. But tonight she didn't feel afraid. She felt something else, something like gratitude, like recognition of a terrible bargain that had saved her life. She spoke without sitting up. "How long can this go on?" The weeping man tilted his head, and his voice appeared in her mind with that familiar cadence. "As long as it needs to. As long as you're not ready. What if I'm never ready, and then I'll be here forever? Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. I'm not a separate person with separate wants. I'm you. I'm the part of you that understands what you can't survive, and I'll hold it for as long as you need me to hold it." Naomi closed her eyes. The weeping continued, filling the studio, and she realized she'd gotten used to it. The sound that had terrified her initially now felt almost comforting, like white noise, like being held. This was what safety sounded like in her fractured reality. Constant weeping, constant grief, held just far enough away that she could function. She opened her eyes and looked at him. He stood in his corner, patient and permanent, and she understood that he would be there forever unless something changed. But that day wasn't today, and it might not be tomorrow, and it might never come at all. The weeping man seemed to sense her thoughts. He tilted his head again, and for just a moment his form softened. The black tears stopped streaming upward. The weeping quieted to something almost gentle. There's no shame in this. Survival takes many forms. This is yours. Naomi pulled the blanket up to her chin and watched him. And for the first time since he'd appeared, she didn't want him to leave. His presence meant she didn't have to feel what he was feeling. His weeping meant she didn't have to weep. His existence meant she could continue existing. She fell asleep like that, watching him. Days passed, then weeks. Naomi developed a routine with the weeping man. She'd go about her day trying to function, forcing herself to eat, occasionally leaving for groceries or to meet Rachel for coffee. And at night, the weeping man would appear, and she'd lie on the mattress and listen to his weeping and feel the strange comfort of knowing her grief was being held separate from her. The letters stopped appearing. The dissociative episodes had stabilized. The weeping man appeared at night, but only in the corner, and Naomi no longer blacked out to write threatening messages. The split had found an equilibrium, a way to coexist. Rachel noticed the improvement. She commented on how Naomi seemed more present, more engaged. And Naomi nodded and agreed and didn't mention that herself now meant a person who cohabitated with a shadow figure that held her grief hostage so she could function. It was manageable. It was survivable. But on a Thursday night in early November, something changed. Naomi was lying on the mattress, watching the weeping man in his usual corner, when he suddenly shuddered. Not the constant trembling that always ran through him, but a violent convulsion that shook his entire frame. The black tears stopped streaming upward. The weeping changed pitch, became more desperate, more raw, and then he started to collapse. Not dissolve or fade. Collapse like something essential had been pulled out from under him. The 7-foot figure began to fold inward, the vertical lines compressing, the darkness peeling away in layers. Naomi sat up, her heart suddenly racing. This was different. This was wrong. The weeping man had been constant for weeks. But now something was breaking down. The darkness continued to peel away, and underneath she could see something else. Not shadow, not absence. Something human. It was her. A version of her, kneeling on the floor in the corner where the weeping man had stood. Small and hunched, her face buried in her hand, her body shaking with sobs so violent they seemed to be tearing her apart. The sound was different from the weeping man's weeping. More raw, more human, more utterly destroyed. This wasn't the mannered grief of an altar holding emotions at a distance. This was the primal sound of someone whose world had ended. Naomi stared at herself, kneeling in the corner, at her own body, at her own shoulders shaking, at her own hands covering her face. The kneeling figure raised her head. Her face was Naomi's face, but younger somehow, more open. The face she'd had before David died, before she'd learned to wall everything off. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Not black, upward-flowing tears, but normal human tears that followed gravity. The other Naomi looked at her from the corner, looked at her with eyes that held a year's worth of grief, of loss, of unbearable knowledge that David was gone and would never come back. She spoke. Her voice was broken, exhausted, at the absolute limit of endurance. I can't hold this anymore. I've been carrying this alone for a year, and I can't do it anymore. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But you have to take it back now. You have to feel this. Air wouldn't move through Naomi's chest. Her lungs had stopped working, because she could feel it now, pressing against the wall the weeping man had built, threatening to break through. The grief, the loss, the terrible crushing weight of David's absence. If I keep holding this, the other Naomi whispered, there won't be anything left of either of us. The split has gone too far. I'm not just holding your grief anymore. I am dissolving under the weight of it. If you don't take it back, if you don't integrate with me, we're both going to disappear. There won't be a you or a me. There'll just be nothing. And Naomi understood what she was saying. The weeping man, the altar, the split-off part of her consciousness, had taken on more than any fragment could hold. The grief was too big. It had been eating away at the altar's structure, and now that structure was collapsing. The compromise they'd struck was failing. She had two choices. Integrate now, take back the grief and face it, or let the whole system collapse. Let both parts dissolve into nothing. Let Naomi Lawson cease to exist entirely. The only way forward is through, the other Naomi said, her voice barely audible now. You have to remember. You have to feel it. You have to weep. Naomi looked at herself kneeling in the corner, at the tears streaming down her own face, at the absolute exhaustion in her own eyes. And she thought about David. Really thought about him, for the first time since he died. She thought about his laugh and his warmth and the way he'd looked at her in the mornings when they were both still half asleep. She thought about the future they'd planned, the house they'd been saving for, the children they'd talked about wanting, the decades of ordinary life that had been erased in a single instant by a dump truck running a red light. She thought about the funerals she'd attended but couldn't remember, about the way she'd refused to look at his body because looking would make it real, about the way she'd packed up their apartment with automatic efficiency, sorting his things into boxes like they were just objects. She thought about the ring in the shoebox under her mattress, about how she still reached for it, still rubbed that pale band on her finger where it had sat for 9 years, about how removing it hadn't changed anything except given her a way to pretend the marriage had never happened, the love had never existed, the loss had never occurred. The wall crumbled. The grief poured through. David, herself, the life they'd been building that would never be built. The grief came through for that October morning when everything had ended, for the years she'd spent pretending to be fine. She wept for all the nights the weeping man had stood in the corner, holding this weight so she wouldn't have to feel it. And she wept because he'd been her all along, because she'd been splitting herself in two to survive and couldn't do it anymore. She wept until her body ached, until her throat was raw, until she had no tears left and could only make dry, gasping sounds. And through it all, the other Naomi knelt in the corner and wept with her. And gradually, slowly, the two figures began to merge. The kneeling form grew translucent. The darkness dissolved into ordinary shadow, and Naomi felt something return to her. Not just the grief, but everything else the weeping man had been holding. The love she'd had for David, the memories she'd been avoiding, the future that had been taken. All of it poured back into her, and it was more than she thought she could hold. More than any person should have to hold. But she held it anyway because the alternative was continuing to split herself forever. The other Naomi smiled. Just a small, sad smile, a recognition that this was necessary and that this was healing, even though it felt like dying. Thank you. Thank you for being strong enough to take me back. And then she was gone, dissolved completely, leaving Naomi alone in the studio with the full weight of her grief and no one left to carry it but herself. 3 weeks passed. Naomi stayed in the apartment and felt everything she'd been avoiding for a year. Some days the grief was so enormous she couldn't get out of bed. Other days it receded enough that she could function. She started seeing a therapist, a woman in her 50s with an office in Fremont, who specialized in trauma and complicated grief. Naomi told her everything, about David's death, about the weeping man, about the dissociative episodes and the slow integration. The therapist listened without judgment and explained that what Naomi had experienced was more common than most people realized. The mind did extraordinary things to survive extraordinary pain. They worked on integration, on building tools for holding grief without fragmenting, on learning to exist with loss rather than walling it off. It was slow work, painful work. But Naomi kept going. She kept feeling. She kept weeping when she needed to weep and functioning when she could function. And slowly, incrementally, she began to build a life that had room for both the grief and everything else. A life where David's absence was acknowledged but didn't consume every moment. A life where she could remember him without fracturing. The corner by the radiator stayed empty. The weeping man never reappeared. Naomi understood why. He'd been created for a specific purpose, and that purpose had been fulfilled. He'd carried her grief until she was strong enough to carry it herself. But sometimes, late at night, she thought she could hear him, just faintly at the edge of perception. The sound of weeping from a place far away, or maybe from deep inside her own mind. A reminder that the capacity for fracture was still there, that if the grief became too much again, her mind knew how to protect itself. She hoped it wouldn't come to that. But there was something almost comforting in knowing the weeping man was still there in potential, still waiting in the architecture of her consciousness. On a Saturday in late November, Rachel came to visit. They sat on the floor with coffee mugs between them, and Rachel looked around at the space that had been so nightmarish weeks before. The lights weren't all burning anymore. The letters had been collected and thrown away. The boxes were unpacked. The apartment looked lived in now. Rachel studied Naomi's face. Naomi met her eyes steadily. She knew she looked different, thinner, more tired, older somehow, but also more present, more solid, more real. Rachel reached out and squeezed Naomi's hand. Said nothing. Didn't need to. Just sat there acknowledging that Naomi had been somewhere terrible and had somehow found her way back. After Rachel left, Naomi went to the shoebox under her mattress. She opened it for the first time since moving to this apartment. David's ring sat inside, gold catching the light. She picked it up, felt its weight, remembered the day they'd chosen it together. She slipped it onto her thumb, too small for her ring finger anymore, but it fit her thumb perfectly. She looked at it there, the band against her skin, and decided she would keep wearing it this way. Not as a wedding ring, not as a symbol that David was still here, but as evidence that he had been here, that their life together had been real, that love didn't vanish just because the person you loved was gone. She stood and walked to the window. It was raining outside, the way it always rained in Seattle in November, steady and soft. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, feeling the cold against her skin, and looked through her reflection to the corner by the radiator. Empty. Just an ordinary corner where two walls met. The shadows there were just shadows again. She thought about the weeping man, about how he'd terrified her and saved her and been her all along, about how the mind protected itself in ways that seemed monstrous until you understood the alternative, about how healing required embracing the part of yourself that had carried what you couldn't carry. She whispered David's name, just once, barely audible, an acknowledgement, a remembering. A promise that she would keep living with his absence rather than pretending it didn't exist. In the corner by the radiator, the shadows shifted, just for a moment. Just the barest suggestion of a figure, 7 feet tall and impossibly thin, with black tears streaming upward from an absent face. And then the shadows were just shadows again, ordinary and still. Naomi lowered her hand from the window and turned away. She had work to do, therapy homework, bills to pay, groceries to buy, the ordinary maintenance of a life that continued despite everything. The grief was still there, would always be there, but she was learning to carry it, learning to exist as someone who had loved and lost and survived. The apartment was quiet. No weeping from the corners, no letters appearing on pillows, just the sound of rain against glass, and the radiator ticking as it warmed the room and her own breathing, steady and strong. She was alone, and that was okay.